Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. You've heard the stories of the Klondike, the frozen rivers, the desperate prospectors, the gold that sparked a northern fever. But what if that wasn't Canada's most extraordinary gold rush? What if, buried under layers of myth and selective memory, there was another gold rush, one that was larger, richer, and more perilous, that helped shape the course of Canadian history, yet remains largely forgotten? Picture this. Desperate men trudging through dense forests and over treacherous mountain passes, lawless boomtowns rising overnight and vanishing just as quickly, fortunes won and lost in days, and indigenous communities displaced and disrupted in the name of gold. This is the story of the Caribou Gold Rush, or perhaps the Porcupine or Fraser Canyon Rush, episodes that predate the Klondike and arguably surpassed it in intensity, scale, and consequence. In the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, these rushes drew tens of thousands of people into the wild, remote interiors of British Columbia and Ontario. They didn't just extract gold from the earth, they forged roads, built towns, and ignited economic and political transformations that would eventually shape provincial identities and Canada's westward expansion. Yet today, these rushes sit in the shadows of more famous tales. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to uncover these overlooked gold rushes, following the paths of fortune seekers through some of the harshest terrains imaginable. We'll meet the self-made millionaires, the swindlers, the indigenous nations caught in the storm, and the ghost towns left behind when the gold ran dry. This isn't just a tale of gold. It's a story of greed, grit, and the price of progress in a land still being defined. It all began with a glint in the riverbed. An ordinary day turned extraordinary when gold was first spotted shimmering beneath the waters of the Fraser River in 1858. Word spread like wildfire. At first, it was just whispers among fur traders and miners, but soon it became a roar, carried across saloons and seaports from San Francisco to Victoria. The Fraser Canyon Gold Rush was born, setting the stage for what would later culminate in the even more intense Caribou Gold Rush further inland by the early 1860s. Tucked deep in the Caribou Mountains of what is now central British Columbia, rich gold veins were discovered near creeks like Williams, Lightning, and Antler. The terrain was remote, dense, and unforgiving, mountain passes choked with snow, thick forests teeming with bears and mud, and river crossings that could kill a man in moments. Yet despite the dangers, the gold was too good to resist. Thousands poured into the region, Canadians from the Maritimes and Ontario, war-weary Americans from California's fading goldfields, and even hopeful miners from as far away as China and Australia. Barkerville, one of the most famous boomtowns born from the Caribou Rush, sprang up almost overnight in the heart of the wilderness, its muddy streets lined with saloons, trading posts, and rough cabins. Within months, it rivaled any gold town in North America in wealth and chaos. In many ways, these Canadian gold rushes paralleled and even rivaled the more famous California and Klondike gold rushes. But they were first. The Fraser Canyon Rush happened a full 40 years before the Klondike and attracted tens of thousands at a time when British Columbia was still a fledgling colony. Unlike the Klondike, where prospectors had to fight brutal Arctic conditions, the Caribou and Fraser Rushes were battles of terrain, isolation, and overwhelming competition. What made them especially significant was their timing. They occurred during a period when the colonial future of British Columbia was uncertain, and the sudden influx of wealth and people forced both Indigenous leaders and British officials to rapidly adapt. These early discoveries weren't just about gold. They ignited economic migration, colonial expansion, and cultural collision on a scale Canada hadn't seen before. They laid the groundwork for infrastructure, such as the Caribou Wagon Road, an engineering feat that opened the heart of the mountains to wagons and, later, trains. And yet, for all their impact, these gold rushes often remain footnotes in Canadian history, overshadowed by the icy drama of the Klondike. But their legacy began with that first sparkle in the riverbed, a moment that transformed the wild into a battleground of ambition and survival. Reaching the goldfields was often more perilous than mining itself. In the Caribou Gold Rush, just getting to the heart of the action meant facing some of the most brutal terrain in North America. Prospectors had to navigate the jagged peaks of the Caribou Mountains, cross raging rivers without bridges, and battle dense forests with little more than hand tools and grit. For many, the journey started in Victoria or New Westminster, followed by a grueling trek inland. The construction of the Caribou Wagon Road, an ambitious project completed in the 1860s, was a lifeline, cutting through cliffs and valleys to connect civilization to the remote goldfields. But even this engineering marvel was no guarantee of safety. Wagons often toppled down ravines, river crossings could sweep away horses and supplies, and sudden snowstorms could trap travelers for days. In the earlier Fraser Canyon rush, many came through the treacherous canyon itself, where narrow paths hugged sheer rock faces above deadly rapids. One slip could mean instant death. Travelers wrote of fording icy rivers waist-deep in snowmelt and climbing switchbacks with packs that cut into their shoulders. There were also dangers from wildlife. Bears and cougars prowled the forests, and wolves trailed behind struggling teams. Bandits, too, knew these trails. Remote areas became ambush zones, especially for those traveling alone or carrying visible wealth. Diaries and newspapers from the time paint a vivid picture. One miner described a section of the wagon road as so steep the mules slid down more than they walked. Another entry tells of a prospector who lost everything when his cart tipped into a river, only to crawl out and start walking again with nothing but a pickaxe. Newspapers like the British Colonist reported on deaths from exposure, starvation, and accidents, often with grim regularity. These journeys were not made by seasoned adventurers alone. Some were farmers seeking quick fortune, others were young immigrants with little wilderness experience. Yet the promise of gold was enough to push them through snow, mud, and fear. The routes to the goldfields became legendary. Not just roads, but rites of passage. They tested every traveler's resolve long before a single nugget of gold was ever found. The journey itself became a crucible, separating dreamers from survivors. As gold fever gripped the wilderness, remote valleys and forest clearings rapidly transformed into bustling boomtowns. Barkerville, born almost overnight in the heart of British Columbia's Caribou Mountains, became the crown jewel of the Caribou Gold Rush. Where once there was nothing but trees and trails, suddenly there were muddy streets packed with tents, wooden storefronts, blacksmith shops, and no shortage of saloons. Within months, Barkerville became the largest town west of Chicago and north of San Francisco, buzzing with miners, gamblers, shopkeepers, and drifters chasing dreams of untold wealth. Gold fever brought chaos as much as it brought promise. The camps pulsed with energy, but also with lawlessness. Fortunes were made and lost in minutes at poker tables or over pans of gold dust. Saloons and dance halls ran late into the night, fueled by whiskey, rumors, and the constant hum of opportunity. Justice was crude and swift, sometimes handled by makeshift courts, other times by fists or firearms. In places like Porcupine, Ontario, during its early 20th century rush, similar scenes played out. Instant settlements, makeshift economies, and streets that turned to mud in spring and dust in summer. Despite the myth of the lone, rugged prospector striking it rich, very few actually did. For most, the dream ended in disappointment, exhaustion, empty pans, and mounting debt. Claims were often bought and sold multiple times, and newcomers frequently arrived too late to find untapped ground. Some who struck gold lost it to theft, gambling, or failed investments. Yet hope never seemed to fade. Even rumors of a new find in a nearby creek could send entire camps packing up and heading out, chasing the next miracle. Amidst the rough-and-tumble frontier life, others quietly built lasting legacies. Merchants often made more than miners, selling tools, food, and clothing at inflated prices. A shovel could cost 5 times what it did back east, and a hot meal was worth its weight in gold. Women, though fewer in number, played vital roles as entrepreneurs, innkeepers, laundresses, and performers. Some carved out niches running boarding houses or saloons, offering rare comfort in an otherwise harsh environment. Immigrants from China, Europe, and the United States also contributed labor and knowledge, sometimes forming their own enclaves and businesses within these volatile towns. These boomtowns were places of extremes, rich with possibility, danger, and fleeting glory. Few lasted beyond the initial rush, but for a brief moment, they stood as monuments to ambition and desperation, echoing with the voices of people who dared to stake everything on a dream buried in the dirt. The gold rushes that transformed Canada's landscape also deeply disrupted the lives of the Indigenous nations who had lived on and stewarded the land for thousands of years. As thousands of prospectors flooded into territories like those along the Fraser River or the Caribou Mountains, Indigenous communities faced massive and sudden displacement. Trails carved into the wilderness were laid across ancestral hunting grounds and sacred sites without consent. Rivers once relied on for salmon were muddied or poisoned by mining runoff, while forests were stripped to build boomtowns and fuel furnaces. The initial encounters between Indigenous peoples and prospectors were often uneasy. Some Indigenous groups participated in the gold economy as guides, traders, or providers of supplies, using their deep knowledge of the land. But as more settlers arrived and encroached on key territories, tension escalated. In several areas, conflict erupted, whether through open violence or through quieter acts of protest, like refusing to allow passage or trade. The colonial authorities rarely protected Indigenous rights. Instead, they often backed the miners, or sanctioned land seizures to promote settlement and commerce. Culturally, the consequences were profound. Indigenous ways of life, rooted in seasonal cycles and communal stewardship of land, were upended by the sudden commodification of natural resources. Elders and leaders expressed concern over disappearing wildlife, declining water quality, and the erosion of traditional practices. Communities that had long traded on their own terms found themselves marginalized or pushed to the edge of the new frontier society. Yet even in the face of displacement, Indigenous peoples showed remarkable resilience. Some formed political alliances to push back against colonial encroachment. Others preserved language, stories, and ceremonies in the face of overwhelming change. Oral histories passed down today often recount not only the trauma, but also the resistance. Moments when leaders stood firm, when communities reorganized, and when land rights were asserted despite the odds. The gold rush may have enriched some and built the foundations of modern towns, but for many Indigenous nations, it marked a period of disruption and loss. Still, their enduring presence and continued efforts to reclaim space through land claims, cultural revitalization, and environmental stewardship remain powerful reminders that these lands were never truly empty nor forgotten. As quickly as the gold rushes ignited, they faded. Once rich creeks and riverbeds were soon exhausted, leaving behind only flakes where there had once been nuggets. The easily accessible gold disappeared, and digging deeper required costly equipment and labor that few could afford. Harsh winters, especially in places like the Caribou or northern Ontario, made year-round mining almost impossible. For many, the dream of fortune gave way to the reality of hardship, and prospectors moved on, to other boomtowns, to the Klondike in the Yukon, or back home in defeat. Boomtowns that had once pulsed with energy and ambition were abandoned in waves. Barkerville, once the largest settlement in British Columbia's interior, became eerily quiet. Porcupine's backwoods trails fell silent, storefronts were boarded up, saloons emptied, and the last echo of boots on muddy streets faded into silence. Across Canada, dozens of once thriving towns were reduced to weather-beaten buildings and forgotten names on old maps. Mines were left open and decaying, machinery rusted in the brush, and homes stood empty, ghost towns in the truest sense. Yet even in their decline, these places left lasting marks. Some have been preserved or revived as historic sites and tourist attractions. Barkerville was restored in the mid-20th century and now stands as a living museum, offering visitors a glimpse into the Gold Rush era with period actors and preserved buildings. In Ontario, museums in Timmins and nearby towns showcase artifacts, maps, and stories from the Porcupine Gold Rush. Hikers and explorers still find hidden ruins, stone foundations buried in moss, rusted pans along streambeds, and trails etched faintly into the landscape. Beyond the physical remains, the legacy of these rushes runs deeper. They spurred infrastructure projects like the Caribou Wagon Road and laid early foundations for towns that would later thrive in other industries. They also brought waves of immigrants, shaping the demographic makeup of frontier regions. The Baihawa commerce, connection, and even conflict they generated helped push Canada's political and economic reach into new territories. Though often overshadowed by more famous events like Confederation or the Klondike Rush, these earlier gold booms played a quiet but crucial role in Canada's development, accelerating its expansion, testing its governance and forever altering the course of its history. This gold rush may not be the one etched into every textbook, but its impact was no less significant. It brought tens of thousands of people across untamed terrain in search of fortune, helped build the foundations of towns, and reshaped Canada's economy, landscape, and relationship with Indigenous peoples. Its boomtowns briefly lit up the map, and though many faded into obscurity, their influence still lingers in museums, in trails through the woods, and in the very fabric of Canadian nation-building. History often remembers the loudest stories, the Klondike, the California Rush, the big names and headline moments, but it's the forgotten ones that show us who we really are. Stories of ambition, struggle, resilience, and transformation in the margins of the map. This gold rush, once roaring with energy, now whispers through ghost towns and worn paths, waiting to be rediscovered. If this hidden chapter of Canada's past intrigued you, consider exploring one of these forgotten towns or share in the comments other overlooked events that deserve the spotlight. And if you're passionate about digging up the untold, the unseen, and the nearly lost, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more hidden history that's waiting to be uncovered.